of climate change. I'm Jeff Yong from the Financial Stability Institute of the Bank for International Settlements, and I'm extremely delighted to be moderating our distinguished panel of speakers today. In this panel, I'm joined by François Bourguignon, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Economics and former Chief Economist of the World Bank, Mary Pangestu, Managing Director from the World Bank, and Pettifor, Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics at Prime, Fiona Reynolds, CEO at the Principles for Responsible Investments, and David Wood, Director at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome all. In the Green Swan book, on which this conference is themed around, Green Swan risks are financially disruptive climate-related events that could cause the next financial crisis. Now, it is encouraging to see collective efforts, including from the financial sector, to avert this catastrophe. But in doing so, there are significant redistributive consequences on how such policies impact lower-income communities and countries, and these need to be simultaneously addressed. In the book, some concrete examples were provided, including how physical risks, such as severe drought, primarily affect poor and middle-income countries. Large swaths of population may move away from their homes as they become uninhabitable. It is estimated that 500 million people are living in areas that are already affected by desertification, especially in Southern and East Asia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. From a transition risk perspective, climate change could disproportionately impact the traditional carbon-intensive industries and consumption habits of poorer countries and lower-income households. Now, in short, studies have shown that climate change impacts are not evenly distributed within regions and that poorer people are more vulnerable. Yet, discussions on policy responses to address climate change often neglect poverty and inequality aspects and do not adequately consider representation of poor and vulnerable social segments. Now, in this panel, we will dig deeper into these issues. We will take 3 rounds of questions to discuss what the problem really is, the potential solution, and what might happen if we don't succeed. We will then take questions from the virtual floor, and I will identify the name and affiliation of participants who pose the questions. Okay, now let's start with clarifying the issue at hand here. What are concrete examples of negative redistributive impacts from climate change, and why do we need to tackle this as part of broader efforts to address climate-related financial risks? Now, let's go around the virtual panel alphabetically, and let me start with François. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, you already mentioned, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I apologize if you hear some noise. This morning, they decided to open up the street in front of my window in Paris. So I'm sorry about this, but there was nothing I could do about it.
No problem at all, no problem.
To answer your question, I believe that you already mentioned a couple of examples of the impact of climate change as it is observed today, and about what is being expected by scientists around the world about the future. But I would say that one maybe more important impact on distribution of climate change will be linked to the policies that will be implemented in order to prevent further degradation of climate change, or in order to mitigate the impact of climate change. And what we have seen in a few countries already is some reaction to this. I mean, if you are introducing some restriction to the use of carbon-intensive activities, if you're introducing some taxes in order to go in that direction, then a part of the population are directly hurt more than others. And here there is a true distribution impact. And we know that in particular, if we think about the carbon tax or any kind of measure that would resemble a carbon tax, we know that it may have a much bigger impact on poor people in a given country. And if we're thinking about international issues, probably more impact among poor countries. So I believe it is in that sense that we should talk about the distributive impact of climate change.
Thanks, François. If I can move now to you, Mary. Why should we be worried with distributive impacts of climate change? I'm sorry, Mary, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Okay, the hazards of virtual room. Yes, thank you, Jeffrey, for your question. And let me just take a developing country lens to answer your question. I think, first of all, we must ensure that when we look at climate impact, we don't look just at the aggregate impact, but at the redistribution and the distributive impact. So a $10 million loss from natural disaster in a well-developed country with good infrastructure and connectivity has a different impact on a disaster, a $10 million disaster, natural disaster that hits the livelihood of subsistence farmers in a poor country, for instance. And then we have redistribution between countries. The lowest income countries contribute around 4% of CO2 emission, but yet they are the worst impacted. You can take the small island states with rising temperatures and sea level. Their countries can actually disappear. My own country, we have 17,000 islands, but in a business as usual scenario, we would probably end up losing 2,000 islands. So there's very country-specific issues that we need to deal with when we talk about climate action and development. We have to put those two together. And third, within countries, you mentioned 130 million. Climate change, natural disasters, and climate change shocks tend to hit the poorest and most vulnerable in any country, poor or more developed. And unaddressed, we estimate that around 68 to 135 million people will end up with extreme poverty by 2030. And there'll be losses of lives, livelihoods, as well as water scarcity, food scarcity, and many other losses. And that's why I think, François, you mentioned policies and regulations. That's another aspect where unless you have a distribution lens in place, you can, if you don't pay attention to the impact of the policies on the poor and the distributional impacts of the transition, then you can also get things wrong and lead to a lot of economics and social and political impact. And finally, the thing I would just say, because we are supposed to be action-oriented in this forum, that's why the World Bank has now just developed and will be implementing in 25 countries in the next year what we call climate action at the country level. Climate and development reports that look deeply into each country, so we can look at the priorities of climate and make sure that the development goals are achieved. This looks at how to integrate climate development and identify the metrics of actions which have impact on both climate and development, and what are the sectoral and macro policies that need to be adopted. And it needs to be a whole of economy and a whole of society approach. So watch that space, and we hope that we can share this diagnostic tool more widely.
Thanks, Mary. I couldn't agree more on your point that how we can get policies wrong if we do not consider poorer population and poorer countries in developing these approaches. Now, turning to you, Anne, how would you frame the issue?
So thank you very much, first of all, Jeffery, for including me and also for hosting this event and putting the emphasis on the redistributive impact. It's really important for the BIS to be doing this. So as we know from both Oxfam, but also the work of Piketty and Chancellor, about 3.5 billion, the poorest half of the global population, are responsible for only about 10% of emissions. 50% of emissions are attributed to the richest 10% of people around the world who have carbon footprints way in excess of what poor people have. And yet policy is aimed in a sort of scattergun approach at everybody. So for me, what I think is really important is for us to be focusing policy at the richest 10%, because we know, for example, that if they were to cut their emissions they are responsible for 50% of consumption emissions. And if they were to reduce their consumption to the level of the average European, that would produce a 30% cut in global emissions in a year. So this need to focus, in my view, not on the majority who are on the whole responsible only for about 13% of global emissions, but on the top 10% who are responsible for so much more is a really important perspective. And secondly, we tend to focus on governments and on nations, but nations really, have very complex ways of and institutional interactions which make it very difficult for governments to act. But on the other hand, we also know that about 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global carbon emissions, according to the Climate Accountability Institute. And by focusing more narrowly on just those 100 corporations, especially in central banking terms and the role in collateral frameworks and so on, we may actually achieve far more quickly than by, again, just expecting, if you like, the little people to all be changing and making changes to their lifestyles, which is very complicated, and asking whole governments to change. Actually, if we just focused on those 100 corporations, and we have the record, Richard, there's been a paper produced which actually documents in great detail the degree to which companies have been emitting over time. So, for me, that narrower focus is more important.
Thanks, Anne. Fiona, do you agree with what we have heard so far? What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with everything, furiously in agreement with everything that's been said. I'd just add that I work with investors, so work within the investment sector. And so part of the work that we've been doing at the PRI is all about how do you get investors to incorporate environmental, social and governance factors into the investment process. Now, when it comes to these issues, I think that part of the problem is that historically, really climate change and then issues to do with people and human rights have really been managed quite separately and governed by different policy frameworks and addressed by different communities of practice and managed by different tools and really treated in isolation. And I think this is also being reflected in the ESG space, where historically there's been a tendency to really silo issues. So you think about the environmental issue over here and how you're dealing with it, and you put climate as an environmental issue and not so much looking at the social issues. So one of the problems with the ESG is that that's really the approach that a lot of investors take, where you need to look at an issue from a holistic point of view, and the social aspects are often missing from the way that investors are thinking about these issues. So they think about climate, they deal with the largest emitting companies in the world, and they think about, my aim is to get the emissions reductions from this company so that we can transition to net zero. Well, yes, that's exactly what we need to do. But in the meantime, we've got to think about the human side. And I think this isn't helpful. And I think that I'm hoping that through work that we're doing and others are doing, that this is changing. But I also think that from this perspective, COVID-19 has woken investors up to a lot more of the social issues. So I think it has clearly demonstrated that if you don't have healthy people and you don't have a healthy planet, then you're not going to have a healthy economy or healthy businesses. But things are interdependent on each other and interconnected. So I'm hoping that this starts to get investors thinking about this in a more holistic way. So we've spent a lot of time in the investment community, for example, talking about stranded assets, but we're always talking about stranded assets from a physical point of view. We're not talking about it from the point of view of people. And people can be stranded assets as well. People are big assets and they're going to be stranded. It's not just like the coal that has to be left in the ground. It's the impact on people. And so we really think that poorly managed, the transition to a net zero future could result in a lot of stranded people, stranded communities, stranded workers. And it needs to be really considered in everything that's done. So we're strongly supportive of the just transition to a net zero economy agenda, and something that we've been trying to build into the work that we've been doing on climate change, so that investors don't just think about it in terms of the physical aspects. I think the other aspect is that if we don't bring people along with us on the transition to net zero economy, then we're unlikely to succeed. And whether you're thinking about a developed or developing economy. So I live in the UK, I'm based in London, but I'm from Australia. Australia hasn't yet committed to a net zero target for 2050. One of the reasons it hasn't is because we're a fossil fuel, economy in terms of resources, and therefore there's concern about the fact that people won't vote for climate action because they're worried about losing their jobs. But there's a simple way to solve this problem when you're in a very rich country, and that is, well, let's have a just transition plan for the country and let's not leave people behind. We shouldn't be leaving people behind. This is more difficult, obviously, in developing countries, and this is where we need the more wealthy countries to provide solutions as well. So, as I said, I think that from the investment perspective, it's making sure that we take a holistic approach to the whole issue of climate and not just a one-sided lens.
Thanks, Fiona. I like your point about people matters, and that's something that we forget quite a lot when we go about discussing these issues. And last but not least, David, can you tell us from your experience, why do we need to tackle redistributive impacts?
Yeah, alphabetical order means I just have to say I subscribe to everything that came before me. And I work on Investors too with Fiona, and sort of prompted by the Principles for Responsible Investment. So that's going to be my lens. And I'd like to say up front, I don't think that's the most important lens. In fact, I think that's necessarily not the most important lens, but investors are a window into some of these challenges. And structural transformation, the just transition is an issue that investors have to take into account like everybody else. So I'll just give three kind of, manifestations of what I think are the negative distributional impacts that we have to wrestle with. One is the shift from coal-fired power plants to wind energy. And in the US, that means moving kind of up from the Midwest into the northern Midwest. It turns out those jobs, which require people to leave their communities and move into new communities, are being offered on terms that are much more precarious than the previous jobs. They're not necessarily unionized. They don't necessarily have the health and safety records. And unless we ensure that precarity is addressed in the transition from one kind of energy to another, the social incohesion that will result, I mean, apart from the sort of ethical concerns that should be obvious, the social incohesion that result will make structural transformation impossible. So that's one thing. You just have to make sure that the new jobs are as good as the old jobs, and that comes with a lot of different lenses, but to me, precarity and durability, right? The new jobs are often offered on a seasonal basis as opposed to sort of a career basis. Then there's the kind of geographical distribution of costs and benefits. The environmental justice community in the US has focused a great deal on the burden that Black and brown communities in particular have taken from the carbon economy. They bear the brunt of it. They bear the risks of climate change disproportionately. How do you manage the transition so that those, both again, the ethical considerations of that distribution are taken into account, but also so that you can bring people on board and sort of make the society more resilient. And then the last one I'll mention is just the kind of global north, global south discussion around just transition. For investors, we've spent way too much time looking at this as a national problem. I mean, I think in part because the way that Paris was designed, you have nationally defined contributions, it becomes a lens for policy, as Anne pointed out, think about national governments. But, you know, shifts in the automotive sector from carbon to low carbon transportation mean huge, massive shifts in the kind of supply chains and resource gathering that's going to take place that create an enormous amount of human rights risk and political risk that has to be taken into account. And in the US, we tend to talk about sort of what happens to coal-dependent communities within the national framework and deindustrialization, like that was on the 70s. But we don't talk as much about the kind of global north, global south issues that will necessarily emerge if we have a global structural transformation.
Thanks, David. So I think we've framed the issue very clearly now. So let's try to dig deeper on what we can do to address this problem. So Mary, if I can start with you. It is startling that according to your agency, the World Bank, if we do not address climate change, over, as you mentioned already, 130 million people will be pushed into poverty over the next 10 years. Now, undoing years and even decades of development gains. From your perspective, what should we do as a global community, including the financial sector, to avoid this looming human catastrophe?
Yes, thanks, Jeffrey, for asking me that very big question. But I think from our perspective, what we're seeing, I think we should recognize that today's situation is very different from, say, talking about this in 2016. What are the two different things? One, for developing countries especially, we are facing a dual crisis, obviously. The socio-economic impacts of the pandemic has accentuated all the development and structural challenges that we faced even before the pandemic. And on top of that, you have the tipping points in the climate crisis, which is impacting, as we just spoke about, which has a big impact on the poorest and the vulnerable countries as well as within countries. And we also know that the zoonotic nature of the virus is also, again, accentuating the link between climate and the pandemic and the economic impacts. So it's never more evident, the link between planet, people, and the economy. And unless we address it in an integrated way and with bold and urgent action, we are going to have a lost decade of development. And you know, we can give you all the assessments on that. So what needs to be done is an integrated approach. We are calling it, for better or worse, we're calling it a green, resilient, and inclusive development. What does it mean? It means, you know, we have obviously looked at sustainability, inclusiveness, and resilience all throughout the last periods. But what is different is to look at it in an integrated way. Sounds easy, but how do we plan to implement that? It needs a whole of economy and whole of society approach. And you must look at the poverty reduction and shared prosperity mission of the World Bank now with a sustainability lens. We probably did that before, but how do we do this now in an implementive way? First, we must have the metrics to capture the impact of sustainable policy and interventions on distribution, just like what we talked about just then. How do we measure the risk exposure, the positive externalities, and the economic gains? And it has to be people-centered. I think we mentioned this just then. It has to be looking at the distribution impact, and it has to be based on partnerships. And how do we support countries in designing and implementing the policies for intervention and prioritizing the actions that has the most development and climate impact? This is really the challenge, and have a just transition to the low carbon development path. And how do you make, some may have already been brave enough to put a net zero target. They all have NDCs of some sort or other, but is it, how credible is it? How can you help them prioritize and have both climate and development impact? You can take, just transition is really the key, but how to implement that. You can take energy transition, which is one of the highest contributors, obviously, to greenhouse gas emissions. For the poor countries in Africa, where 50% of are still not having electricity, it's about energy access. It's not about exit of coal. It's about energy access. So what is the kind of energy access, new renewable energy-based energy access? Can they actually get there? Whereas for the middle income countries, it is about exiting from coal. And then what do you do with the sectors that are impacted from the coal transition or the hydrocarbon transition? And then how do we take advantage of the situation to also seize opportunities? Oh, let me just mention something which is very important. The political economy of coming up with these policies is crucial. And so we need to be able to come up with tools that allow politicians to say, okay, because it requires investments now with future benefits. They have to be able to say jobs lost, jobs created, human capital losses because of pollution and productivity losses and health losses, which are already impacting people now. How do we address that? Because I faced that when I was a policymaker. How do I convince the policymakers to make the decisions now which have a longer term impact? So I think we need to really, that's why the metrics and the narrative underlined with evidence is very important, and hopefully we start seeing some examples of countries being able to do this. That's why our country diagnostic tools are very important. And then the other thing I would say is that adaptation and resilience is equally as important as the mitigation aspects of climate, especially for the poorest and vulnerable countries. And here, that's why in our new climate action plan, we have 35% climate financing as a target, but not just as a climate co-benefits, but how does it actually impact development? And at least 50% must be targeted to adaptation. And there's a whole sets of actions that you need to undertake for adaptation and resilience. And I think climate policies are very important. How do we have the right incentives? Carbon pricing being a very important tool. And I think supporting greening the financial sector, that will be my last point because of the forum we're in. How can we support efforts to green the financial sector? Because what needs to happen is the policy reforms and changes at the sectoral and macro level need to happen, and countries need to do that, to have the transformative investments. But for that to happen at scale, they need financing, right? So how do we also then need the greening of the financial sector? 3 tracks: disclosure. This is key for improved reporting, risk management, and climate risk informed investments. And there is, I know there's a growing momentum on this, but what we are seeing is that it's very important to be mindful of the interests and perspectives of emerging markets so that the proposed standards are fit for purpose and provide a global minimum reporting baseline acceptable to EMDEs. Otherwise, they are going to be shut out of the capital markets. Risk management at sovereign firms, including financial ones, and at household levels, and designing and offering market-based risk finance and insurance products, as well as financial digital services benefiting the most vulnerable is key. Most vulnerable households invest in physical assets which can get wiped out in a natural disaster. So how do you get them to diversify? Green financing in ways that investments support transition and adaptation of the real economy towards sustainable economy. Financial solutions to support nature-based solutions are very important. Financing mitigation is quite different from financing adaptation, resilience, and even biodiversity, but yet they are very important for climate. So just finally, because we are supposed to be sharing actions that we are doing, we are proposing a resilience rating system, which aims at informing investors and decision makers so that they can prioritize projects that are resilient to climate change and natural disasters, as well as boost the resilience of the population. So we will be publishing this. We did actually publish the methodology a few months ago, and we're piloting it in 20 of our own projects in the poor IDA countries. So hopefully this can be a learning experience and tool further down the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. That's a very rich array of possible things that we should be doing. And now turning to you, François, if we could unpack what Mary's mentioned about taking an integrated approach. Now, this would inevitably involve using carbon tax as a tool to counter negative distributive effects. On the face of it now, making the rich pay more to compensate for the poor, to incentivize greener lifestyles, for example, makes a lot of sense. So why are we not already seeing widespread use of carbon tax if this is a no-brainer?
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And indeed, as Mary said, I mean, carbon pricing is certainly a very, very important part of the policy framework in order to mitigate the impact of climate change and in order to prevent further degradation. Now, the point about the carbon tax, which is obviously the most obvious way of changing the price of carbon, and I would like to mention that I will be referring to a tax, but we may also consider that all kind of risk on the use of carbon, on the emission of carbon, is equivalent to a tax. So what we have to take into account is really all those measures which are trying to reduce the use of the emission of carbon. But if we look at the tax, what we have to keep in mind that a tax on carbon is not a priori a redistributive tax. The tax on carbon has only one goal, which is to modify the consumption behavior of people so that they will be consuming less carbon intensive services or carbon intensive goods. Then we may consider that this tax has a distributive impact which is not satisfactory, in the sense that maybe poor people will be more affected because they are consuming relatively more carbon-intensive goods than other people. And you may remember that 2 or 3 years ago, France had this big problem, this big social protest, which arose from an increase in the carbon tax. People saying that we are living very far from work. For us, driving is extremely important, and this carbon tax is reducing our standard of living. This was a redistributive issue which was linked to the carbon tax, which means that if you want to implement these carbon pricing policies, at the same time we must have side redistribution policies that will be undoing the impact on the distribution, the negative impact on the distribution of carbon tax policies. This is something which is essential and which for the moment has not been very well seen by many policymakers in those countries. It should be the case that a carbon tax is not to get more tax revenues. It is not to do that. A carbon tax is something which is meant to change behavior, and it is we should be able to redistribute the produce of the tax in such a way that there is no impact on the no negative impact on the distribution. But the other point I wanted to mention, and which is maybe closer to your question, Jeffrey, we observe these days that Europe is probably that part of the world where people or countries are the most serious about the carbon tax. Some countries have already been very far in the carbon tax, and today there is a view that this must be a EU policy. I think that people are rather serious from that point of view. And you could say that this is redistributive at the global level because these are advanced countries which decide to move into the carbon tax. And the cost of the tax primarily will be on the citizen in the EU. But the point I want to emphasize is that this carbon tax in the EU has an impact on the rest of the world. And the impact may be very negative on developing countries. And let me take something which is very much discussed in the EU today, which is the carbon tax at the border. If you have a carbon tax within a country or within a set of countries like in the EU, you cannot not control the carbon intensity of imports. If not, then companies in the EU will simply outsource their production to the rest of the world, and there will be no change in terms of carbon emission. But what will be the impact of those carbon tax at the border? It will be to reduce the exports from a set of developing countries. In particular, all those countries which are exporting basic commodities like oil, gas, but also mineral commodities will be definitely hurt by this policy. Exporters of manufactured goods will be in the same situation because they will not have taken the measures to reduce carbon emission because they are far away. When you are transporting garments from Asia to Europe, the cost of transportation and the carbon emission transportation is huge. So there will be a tax on this. So we must be quite clear on the fact that if the EU is going in that direction, which is fine, which is really something which has to be done, but at the same time, in line with what I said at the beginning, you need to have some redistribution taking place. And you must compensate the damage that is being done to other countries in the world, in particular to poorest countries, because of this policy which is followed in the EU. And I think this is quite important because this ties very much with what Anne said at the beginning, saying that there is this kind of basic inequality in the fact that rich countries are responsible for most of the emission, and they're asking all the world to pay for it. This is part of the story, but this means that there must be some redistribution associated with any kind of carbon tax policy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, François. Now, Fiona, taking François' point on using carbon tax to correct income imbalances and tying this to the fact that over 100 countries have set or are considering net zero emission targets, this provides huge opportunities, but also threats to poorer countries and communities in terms of widening inequalities. Now, how do we make sure that no person and indeed no country is left behind in this once-in-a-lifetime shift towards a greener and more sustainable world?
Sure. Well, I think I'm going to come back to the point I was trying to make before. Again, I'm coming at this very much from an investment lens, and that we really need to be adopting that holistic approach and considering the social implications of climate change when we're trying to design solutions, whether that's governments, investors, business, etc. And it can't be just an add-on, it can't be just an afterthought, but really considered as a core element of the climate transition and every solution that we do. So what we're trying to do at the PRI is, at the moment, investors tell us that the number one issue that they are focused on, that they're considering, that they're working on, is climate change. So we're trying to elevate human rights to the same level as climate change within the work programs that we're doing and things that we have, like the Just Transition. And we're really trying to get our signatories, our members, to really consider the implications of the transition to a low carbon economy on workers, on communities, on developing countries as well as developed countries, on consumers, in terms of access to affordable energy and to environmentally friendly solutions. So if decarbonisation as people have said, just leads to visibly increasing inequalities in society, then it risks hampering or really stopping climate action because of social or political backlashes that it will trigger. So really we need to enact large-scale systemic changes to combat climate change, and we need a social contract that really addresses the impact of workers and their communities, especially those facing systemic inequalities. I think achieving the decarbonisation targets must be done in a way that creates decent work and supports broad prosperity by maintaining strong communities and strong economies and thriving communities. A lot of the solutions that we see being designed at the moment to fight climate change are just not really taking into consideration the unintended consequences and effects that they may have on workers and communities. I think it's too much focused on the emissions reduction target. You know, the ILO projects and predicts that if the right policies to promote a greener economy are put in place, then 24 million new jobs will be created, more than enough to offset the 6 million jobs that will be lost as we transition. Of course, as David said, one of the really important things is that as we create new jobs, that they're good jobs. I often talk about my father-in-law who was a coal miner, but as a coal miner, you used to be able to bring your family up really well. And those jobs had things like pensions attached to them. They had healthcare, etc., attached to them. They had a decent wage. They were highly unionised. And we've got to make sure all of these jobs that we create are decent jobs in that context. I think investing more in the green economy can really advance the decent work and inclusive work agenda if it's rooted in international human rights, as environmental degradation disproportionately affects the vulnerable populations and low carbon economies. Recovery plans should really adopt just transition principles to ensure that jobs are created across society that match with investments in net zero emissions energy, industrial building and transport systems, and include climate resilience measures has also been talked about. So we need to really ensure that there's a people-centric approach, workers, communities, most effective, that they have a voice in all of this. You know, in the midst of the global climate emergency, escalating inequality and the COVID pandemic, we've already seen that taking place. So I don't think we can exacerbate that growing inequality even further. So it's really paramount that we address inadequacies and the unstable nature of our current financial and economic systems. So international human rights standards, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement are really the universal frameworks that must be used. So we're again, coming back, we're really trying to get our investors to engage with investee companies, the businesses that they're invested in, to make sure that this is done in a holistic way, that we think about human rights and we think about climate in the same way. And we've put together a number of guides with David's organisation. We've put together statements about a just transition, but it just comes back to thinking about it holistically, but make sure that it flows into all of our work programs, whether they're from governments, whether they're from investors, whether they're from business or civil society groups.
Thanks, Fiona. David, building on Fiona's point that climate justice is part of human rights, now some has characterized this decade as being the decade of social justice, from the Black Lives Matter movement to gender equality, and this month, the Pride celebrations. Now, in the context of our discussion today, the Extinction Rebellion is demanding climate justice. How can we mainstream the climate agenda? How can we mainstream this issue into the climate agenda of the global financial community?
So it's a complicated question with the word mainstream stuck in there, right? At the last PRI in person, so Fiona's organization has a big event where we all get together from the community globally, and sadly we don't see each other anymore. But the last one, when we were all in the same place, so I heard someone in the hallway say, "Gosh, these people won't stop talking about just transition." And we thought, "Oh, this is great, right? We've made it. Now it's on the investor agenda," but it hasn't led to a lot of action. It's led to a lot of talk. So I'll say two things: what investors can do, and then what sustainable finance policy can do. So what can investors do that would sort of lead to action and put the kinds of things Fiona's talked about into practice? Well, there's Climate Action 100 Plus. It's the biggest collaborative organization of investors engaging around climate issues. Where do issues about workers and communities enter into that work? One of the things we've been doing is talking with actually a group of faith-based investors called the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility here in the States about engaging public utilities, publicly owned utilities, publicly traded utilities, that all have decarbonization plans, but in those decarbonization plans, apart from the adequacy of the decarbonization by 2050, kind of thing, workers and communities just don't appear. But how can investors bring those issues to the fore when they have the scenario planning? Climate Action 100 Plus just had a great week last week, right? Real big news out of Exxon. Where do we integrate just transition into those kinds of victories? Some investors, there's an organization I'm just fascinated with called the Solidarity Funds in Quebec. It's a worker-owned and led supplemental retirement fund. So not sort of a defined benefit pension plan, but a retirement fund that came out of the labor movement. And they invest in SMEs throughout Quebec who are in sort of carbon-intensive manufacturing. They're not the lender of last resort, but they're kind of the investor that covers the whole province. They've engaged their workers directly about their fears and the opportunities there are for decarbonizing within their sectors. Like, what will a worker-led just transition look like, and how can investors push that? That would be, another thing investors can do. Or they can enter into social dialogue. In South Africa, there's a presidential commission on the just transition. It's not clear where investors fit in the conventional role of business, labor, government, social dialogue that is sort of embodied in South African and lots of European practice. So far, investors are usually used to dissolve social dialogue, right? With market efficiency being used as a counterpoint to long-term planning. So that's what investors can do. They can engage the workers directly. They can take on the top 100 emitters. They can be part of broader, embedded in broader social structures. I think the other sort of big victory for responsible investment over the past year or 2 years is the shift towards sustainable finance policy. And Mario already talked about disclosure and sort of disclosure regimes. There's a lot of climate disclosure regimes happening right now in the US and in the EU. Where do social issues fit in? The EU sustainable finance taxonomy, it consciously push social issues to the next round, right? Well, they should be in the first round. If the SEC asks for climate disclosure, it should ask for transition disclosure as well. This is not because that's what a holistic approach looks like. And lastly, I think carbon taxes, and I totally agree with François that if you have carbon taxes, you have to have redistribution, and that's one policy. We're spending a lot more time these days, I think, or at least the climate activist community with whom I engage, talking about industrial policy. So public finance on the front foot. And in the US, potentially the creation of a public investment bank or some kind of vehicle for the Build Back Better agenda. How do we deploy the frame of just transition? How do we integrate environmental and social considerations? Where does racial justice, decent work, and decarbonization intersect in a public investment agenda that will shape private markets and, like disclosure, lead to different kinds of behavior from investors because you're setting prices differently and you're sort of redirecting economic activity towards the things we need for a super fast, immense structural transformation of the whole global economy.
Thanks, David. Just a notice to our panel, we are about 10 minutes behind time. So if you could cut the next round of your planned intervention by half, that would be appreciated. Now, if I could turn to you, Anne, on this to wrap up this round of questions. This conference is about coming up with concrete actions, meaning that all the ideas that we have discussed so far need to be implemented by someone and some institution. Now, how do we move from talking endlessly about correcting distributive effects of climate change to taking concrete, tangible actions?
Thank you, Jeffrey. Well, first of all, can I say that You know, we're talking about concrete actions when we talk about carbon taxes. And I agree with, well, I think François made the case against carbon taxes, and I'm against carbon taxes, which I see as regressive. In particular, if we're just using these market-based solutions while we don't offer alternatives. So very clearly with the Gilets jaunes in France, there was the issue of punishing punitive actions against consumers while not offering those consumers or those travelers or whatever alternatives. So no amount of soft words about, you know, just transition and sustainability and being kind to the poor and all of that matters if we don't make the structural changes necessary that enable people to behave differently and be differently. And that's why I find the whole carbon pricing debate really deeply flawed. But for me, the other really big problem, and this is why we're gathered here today, is the role of private capital in all of this. Carbon financiers already see the climate crisis not as a threat, but as an opportunity to make high capital gains. And I've already, you can quote the CEO of BlackRock, who said that as much in the pages of the Financial Times. And what they're particularly looking for, and what I'm afraid the World Bank has been encouraging, is subsidized greenwashing, essentially, leveraging private capital for development, whereby private capital wants to engage in dealing with the climate threat, but on the basis of de-risking strategies undertaken by central banks and governments, and also subsidies for those risks. You know, the private sector, which has grown and which is, we're told, based on the whole notion of risk-taking, is demanding that taxpayers in that states begin to de-risk their activities in relation to climate. So they're seeing this as being an enormously profitable opportunity and relying increasingly on ESG ratings. And as far as I can tell, and as my colleague, Professor Daniela Gabor has argued, you know, the private ESG ratings have expanded massively. And in the United States would gain to amount to something like, to cover something like $69 trillion of assets by 2025. But we need public ratings, and that is why the work of the European Commission is so important in developing a taxonomy of what is green and what is brown, a public taxonomy which is accountable and transparent and so on. But already the EU taxonomy is subject to heavy lobbying by the carbon sector, the private sector, wanting in 3 categories of taxonomy: sustainable, enabling, and transition. And basically all of those transition risks are ways in which the private sector is demanding protection by central banks, by states, by taxpayers. And on the one hand. On the other hand, the taxonomy is not yet tackling penalizing brown activities. So we may well develop a taxonomy which rewards green investors, but fails to punish or penalize brown investors and brown investments. And unless we start to get tough about this and realize that actually the urgency is far greater than many of us are accepting. I was very pleased to hear Frank Elderson of the ECB today stress the urgency, stress the fact that these emissions are rising, the temperatures are rising, that there's almost no chance of us achieving, reaching 1.5 degrees. It's much more likely that we will hit 2 degrees warming, and that will be catastrophic. It will make this a different planet altogether. So, you know, we're under very grave pressure and very grave threat. And so we need both public and state intervention, as well as a role for the market, as well as a role for the private sector. But as things are going at the moment, and led by the World Bank, there's an increasing dependence on private capital for addressing these, and private capital is leaping at this opportunity in order to obtain protection and subsidies from the state, while at the same time de-risking their activities. This is not the time or the place for that, especially when it comes to thinking about the impact of all this on poor people. And that's the problem with carbon pricing. It is going to inadvertently penalize a whole cross-section of society, when actually, as I tried to say at the beginning, we should be going after the Bill Gates of this world that fly to to UN conferences on climate change in their own private jets, right? That's where the pressure has to be applied, because that's where we can achieve, the greatest number of reduction in emissions, while at the same time using capital owned by that sector and aiming it at a more sustainable reduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. So let's move to the last round of questions. If I can ask all of you to limit your intervention to just 1 minute to answer this question. So if you fail to transition inclusively to a low carbon world, apart from the social repercussions, what could be the consequences on lower income countries and communities, and indeed the global financial system? And after this round, we will move on to taking questions from the audience which are coming in. So who would like to jump in on this question?
I'm happy to start.
Please.
Can I say that you've put this already into the future tense, Jeffrey? We have known for decades that the impact of this is going to be worst on the low-income countries, poor countries, and they already are suffering those impacts. So we should not be talking about this in terms of what will happen next. It's already happening. Those countries and those people are already suffering.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, we cannot fail because the effect will be very disastrous. So I think I just want to mention that we talk a lot about what needs to be done and how to help countries come along on this process, as well as companies, and avoid greenwashing. I just want to emphasize that this notion of Paris aligned, World Bank Group has already committed to being Paris aligned by 2023. But agreeing to that definition needs metrics, so that we don't be doing greenwashing, as many of you have mentioned. And the metrics for the private sector is equally important, whether it's the standards and the disclosure and so on. But we need to ensure that it doesn't shut out developing countries in that process. And there's a lot of capacity building also in the regulatory side and the reform side, also for the financial sector. So we need the resources, but we also need the technology. That's the other aspect we didn't talk about today, but this is what will be needed to not fail.
Thanks, Mary. And François?
No, I would tend to agree with Mary in the sense that we cannot fail, because this would be a total disaster. But nevertheless, we should be aware of the fact that the transition will not be an easy transition. There is a cost to be paid collectively, but during the transition, because moving from a technology to another, making sure that the new technology will be available, to have people changing the jobs, changing sectors, this is socially costly, and in general, this has a huge negative distributive impact. Because of that, it is absolutely essential to keep in mind already today that in order to go through the transition period, we need to have the right redistributive instruments, so that the people who are penalized by the evolution are compensated as much as possible. Perfect compensation in general is not completely possible.
Thanks, François. Fiona, please.
Fiona, okay. Well, I agree with what's been said in the main, of course, that we can't, and of course that we can't fail. I agree with that. I think, well, we do need private sector. We do need the private sector. We're not going to get there without the private sector. The private sector, well, I work a lot with pension funds. Their job's to make money, so we have to keep that in mind as well. They've got a role to play, and from our perspective, I think that we need governments to make sure. I agree with everything that Mary was talking about all the right disclosures, so that we don't have greenwashing, of course, but we also need governments to be looking at their industrial policies in ways that will actually incentivize the private sector. So if we say that this is the end day for the combustion engine, for example, then we drive investment into electric vehicles, the same if we change agricultural practices, the same if we end fossil fuel subsidies, the same if we put a whole lot of things in place that is going to drive incentive in carbon capture and storage and the new technologies that we need. I think I'll just add on one of the things that in climate that I don't think that's talked about enough, but it's the one thing I think that really one of the things that keeps me awake at night is particularly those who live in low-lying countries, that eventually we're going to have so many climate refugees if we can't solve this problem. And if you look around the world, how we treat the refugee problem that we already have, which is huge, we are appalling at dealing with it. So we are going to have a much bigger refugee problem. We're going to have bigger problems of growing inequality for how people want to deal with people from different countries and race and how they treat them. And we're sleepwalking into disaster.
Thanks. And David?
Yeah, I totally agree with Fiona, especially sort of on viewing the refugee crises that we have now as manifestations of the failure of a global system to deal with justice. Just on the general point about what happens if we fail or what do we need to not fail, I think Fiona's right with industrial policy, but it really, I don't think we need to think about incentivizing or disincentivizing private sector activity. I think we need to think about controlling and reshaping our economic forces, because without planning, we're not going to get there. It's just too fast. It's just too big. And a lot of the problem with investment, I think the responsible investment is a reaction to the assumptions that the finance sector will naturally adjust to change. We're not going to adjust to change. We're not adjusting to change. We need to drive finance towards more productive activity and lower carbon activity and, ethically fair distribution of costs and benefits in this transformation.
Thanks, David. And now we move to the Q&A part of the session. If I could ask all panelists, when you answer the question, to also provide your final say, that would be great, so that we can wrap up on time. So the first question I have here comes from Pierre Monin, Council on Economic Policy. Pierre is asking, which concrete actions or policies could central banks and financial regulators take to support both transition to a low carbon economy and most vulnerable stranded households? So win-win policies on both dimensions. So who would like to take that? So concrete actions and policies that central banks and financial regulators can take. Anne, please.
So, I mean, I think central banks can redesign their collateral frameworks. The fact of the matter is that they accept collateral that often is brown. They can be far more stringent about that. They can define that which is green, make sure that that is a transparent process and that it's credible and it has integrity, those definitions, but can also decide to penalize or to reject assets or collateral that is brown. It's a very, very concrete action. We've seen how absolutely central banks have been to the pandemic, to helping corporations deal with the pandemic. They need to now be making sure that, it's not simply a matter of buying up all private assets that have become distressed, but instead of making a distinction between green and brown assets. Mm-hmm. And I think that would have a major impact on corporations and on the economy.
Thanks, Anne. We have a question here for Fiona on your definition of just transition. This is in reference to your opening statement that you spoke about Australia being a fossil fuel-based economy. How does this concept of just transition apply, or is it different in the context of a less developed economy?
Well, I do obviously think it's different if you're in a developed country than a developing country. If you're in a developed country, then there should be no reason why any worker gets left behind or any person gets left behind, because the country can actually afford to do things, whether that is the country can, if someone's an older worker, bring them, bring in pensions early. If you're, retrain people, governments can afford to do these things. They're very different concepts when you're talking about a developed versus developing country that may not have the resources to do it. If the private sector is in there though, if the private sector is operating, large multinational countries within developing countries, then they have to be doing their role and playing their role in the transition, which is something that we have been working with investors and business on to various levels, degree of success. I mean, David talked about before about Climate Action 100+, not enough investors, again, thinking about the just transition, bringing into their plans. Well, there's a new benchmark that we've developed through Climate Action 100+. It's done by an external organisation, and they are benchmarking across a number of things that companies are doing in the transition, and that includes a just transition. So at least we can know, at least we can see it, and then it helps us going forward to take the issues forward.
Thanks, Fiona. If I can move to a question for Mary. So for those of you who watched the Leaders Summit on Climate convened by President Biden back in April, and Mary, I watched your interview in that event as well. You may recall remarks made by Prime Minister Shering from Bhutan, who said that small nations like Bhutan has done a lot, even aiming to be carbon negative in Bhutan's case, and yet they are still exposed to extreme climate change events. So the question is, how can the international community or international organizations give greater voice to smaller nations in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, that is why we really need to make sure that climate and development are integrated. And we have to make sure that in the case of Bhutan, it's a question of adaptation and resilience, and making sure that the others are going to take action because they are impacted by the climate actions. So we need to address the smaller vulnerable countries as well as the large emitters. So besides the advanced countries, we have the major emitters who will need support and helping them to design a just transition out of the fossil-based development path that they've been on. Because what happens is that climate impacts on development, but development business as usual is also going to impact on climate. So how do we help these countries to transition and making reality and understanding the political economy of just transition, just as François mentioned. And that requires the design of the policy reforms that countries have to do, but it does need resources and technology that need to come from the international community, whether it's the IFIs, whether it's the bilateral donors, and this 100 billion that is supposed to help developing countries adjust. How do we make that effective and really address a just transition to a low carbon development path that will benefit all in developing and developed countries. And you do need to address developing countries because they contribute 2/3 of the CO2 emission. So without them in the equation, you are not going to solve the climate goals.
Thanks, Mary. And to François. So in our conversation so far, we have talked about the rich and the poor, and yet there's a huge middle income segment. Now, how can we make sure that policies to support the poor to live greener do not disadvantage the middle income segments? Or in other words, why should middle income earners continue to strive for economic prosperity if slipping down is much better?
I believe this question raises the issue of the political economy of taxation and redistribution. In most countries, policies which are aimed at relieving poverty or at making poor people a little better off, in general, have to receive the support of the middle class. because the middle class would not be willing to be penalized because of that. So in general, I would say that there is a kind of coalition between the poorest part of the population and the lower middle class. So I don't think this is, when we think about redistribution, I think that we should not really have a view at poverty in a very strict sense of people below this poverty line. We must have poverty in a relative sense, meaning in the same way as the World Bank is using shared prosperity, looking at the bottom 40%, it is clear that the bottom 40% in many countries is including part of the middle class. So I think that if we see issues in that sense, we are more or less okay. And I wanted to add one remark, because I didn't want what I said to be misinterpreted. I'm not saying that carbon pricing is the only solution to the transition. I mean, clearly, industrial policies, clearly initiatives of various types trying to limit carbon emission, all those policies directed toward renovating residential building in order to make them more climate efficient. All this is quite important. But at the same time, all these policies, because they have a cost, one way or another, will have to be paid by somebody. And because of that, the redistribution issue is still there. But it is true that my argument was a simple argument based on a simple concept, which was the price. But we can expand that very, very easily.
Thanks, François. And David, finally, you have the last word. If you could share your thoughts, your final say in 1 minute, please go ahead.
I don't feel like I should have the last word. Yeah, thanks for putting this on the agenda. I mean, I think this is, the social issues need to enter into the climate change discussion in my world, about financial systems, about how investors act. It's been very obvious to me for a while, and to Fiona and to others who are working on this, that climate has pushed out important considerations about workers and communities and distribution, and this is a place where we can try to redress that problem, and that will allow for a transformation. Social cohesion is the precondition of a low carbon transition.
Wonderful. Now, when I was preparing for this session, I was reading a fiction about how a catastrophic heat wave in a developing country killed thousands of people. Now, and this prompted a climate uprising from the climate oppressed part of society, with really, really nasty things happening to those they felt responsible for climate change. Now, interestingly, I'm not sure if you read the book, interestingly, central banks and including the BIS featured in this novel, and in better light, I must say. Now, unfortunately, I didn't quite reach the end of the book, and I suppose we are in a similar place right now, in that we are all writing our own history on how we are dealing with climate change in a just way. Now, clearly, transitioning to a low carbon economy needs to go hand in hand with narrowing income inequalities. Without the support from all countries and communities, net zero goals will be in jeopardy. Now, from reallocating displaced workers to establishing carbon taxes, the concerted efforts will be needed to achieve a just and inclusive transition. And finally, let me leave you with one last question as a final thought. Can we maintain global financial stability without climate equity? Now, with that, I'd like to thank all our excellent panelists for this very interesting conversation, and thank you to our audience for listening in. And one last housekeeping announcement. For all the participants watching this session, please return to the BIS YouTube stream to follow our upcoming guest speeches from Robert Engel and Al Gore. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
What was the book called, Jeffrey?